American President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau are reportedly discussing carbon border adjustments. And so, what are carbon border adjustments? We're going to talk to Francis Fong, who's a senior economist with TD Bank, and about that, and find out where the discussions currently are and what a carbon border adjustment is. So, welcome to the interview, Francis.
Thanks for having me again, Markham.
Now, you've co-authored a study on carbon border adjustments. Why don't we start with what they are?
Absolutely. So a carbon border adjustment is essentially a policy tool that governments use to adjust for some sort of a domestic tax policy kind of issue. Typically, we've seen these things when we talk about, consumer taxes like value-added taxes. More recently, there was a big discussion about border adjustments in President Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act around territorial corporate tax systems, where essentially you kind of apply an import levy on importing firms or rebate whatever tax you happen to be talking about for exporting firms. In the case of what we're talking about here, carbon border adjustments, we're talking about carbon taxes. So for countries that are applying a carbon tax framework to domestic firms, essentially what a border adjustment would do is try to equilibrate the competitiveness issue that is created by a carbon tax, and also address, more importantly, this issue around carbon leakage. So the idea here is if you apply a carbon tax on your domestic firms, then the challenge that's created by that is that they're now competing on kind of an uneven ground. Because they're facing a cost that others don't. So basically a carbon border adjustment would address that.
That's an interesting question, because I've done other interviews on carbon border adjustments, and the question is, what about some of these? Many of our industries don't face competition from international firms, and so oil is one that there's not a lot of competition. Cement, actually, there's not a lot of cement producers coming up from the United States to compete with Ontario cement producers, as an example. So how do they sort that out?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, when we're talking about border adjustments, we're really talking about where there happens to be a lot of trade exposure and a lot of movement across borders. For, resource heavy firms where you're really talking about extracting things out of the ground and really kind of, applying some sort of manufacturing process, those might be less impacted than one might think, and that's just the nature of the business. So really, I think we're talking about more of those traded goods. And of course, if we start talking about resources, oil in particular, the real challenge is, particularly in Canada, how are we, going to be applying these levies when really oil moves across the border every day from Canada to the US and then back to Canada? Line 5 is an obvious example, a relevant kind of timely example where it would be a real challenge to apply a border adjustment on those kinds of things. So, there's, I think, a really kind of important discussion about how a border adjustment will get applied to different categories of goods across different countries, which is, indeed what a lot of countries are trying to figure out right now.
Well, one of the issues, one of the resource issues that comes up right away is not just oil, but Alberta oil sands, because of course, bitumen is very, very carbon intense. And you would think that a carbon border adjustment would catch that and raise the prices. And we saw last week that the oil sands companies came together in a pathways initiative to net zero by 2050 to lower their emissions quite significantly. And you have to think that they're looking ahead to these kinds of initiatives and thinking, maybe it's time we lowered our emissions significantly, because it's going to cost us if we don't.
And that's exactly right. It's a great point to bring up. And quite frankly, it's in complete alignment with a lot of the messaging we're hearing about out of the Canadian oil sands or the oil sector more broadly, about how Canadian producers are some of the cleanest in the world. We're making huge efforts to try to lower the level of per barrel emissions intensity of oil sands, so on and so forth. In an environment where border adjustments are fully in place around the world, that could actually work in favor of oil sands producers here in Canada, simply because it makes us more competitive relative to some of the more emissions intensive production around the world, but does not have any kind of climate policy or carbon tax policy that's kind of raising the price there. So there's a real upside here, I think.
Well, let me take the opportunity, as I always do, to boost my 2019 book, The New Alberta Advantage, technology policy in the future of the oil sands. The whole thesis of the book is that the oil sands CEOs in the 7, 8 years ago figured this out, and we're already moving towards lowering emissions because they saw it as a competitiveness strategy, right? Like if you want to get into Asia and you're competing against Saudi Arabian oil or heavy or Iranian heavy, and you have already lowered the emissions, then and you're paying a carbon tax, then you have a competitive advantage over other crudes. So that's absolutely, it's a very good example. And if anybody wants to buy the book, they can do so from our website. So there we go. There's my plug. So let's talk about some of the challenges because, you talked about trade coverage. So different sectors, I assume that's what you're referring to. Different sectors have different issues.
No, absolutely. I mean, when we talk about trade coverage, we're really talking about a number of different things, actually. We're talking about, first of all, in a purest sense, a border adjustment actually addresses both exporters and importers. So if you're importing into the country, you would have an import levy applied that would equilibrate, what you might pay in a carbon tax framework. And exporters, in turn, would be rebated their carbon taxes that they pay domestically if they're moving goods overseas. And the idea there is that, we don't want to punish our domestic producers from being able to compete on a level basis outside of the country. But of course, if you rebate exporters the carbon taxes that they pay, then you're essentially removing any kind of incentive for them to eliminate their emissions in the first place. So more likely, we're going to see it mainly applied in an import levy framework. But the challenge here is really around how do you estimate the emissions intensity of imported goods? That's a really difficult question to answer when you consider that there are, what are you considering here? Scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of foreign producers of all different manufactured goods. What about shipping? What about all the different types of emissions that they face, not just combustion sources, but non-combustion sources, HFCs, if you're moving, if you're shipping goods across oceans, all of these factors, you have to kind of consider when calculating this. But of course, the more complex it gets, the harder it is to do. But if you try to simplify it on the other side of that coin, like you could just say, hey, if you come from X country, we're going to apply some flat levy. If you do that, then there's the risk that it runs afoul of WTO rules around specifically these kinds of things, discrimination and things of that nature. So it's a very complex issue that, for example, countries like the EU or countries within the EU, the UK, and then here in Canada and the US, we're all talking about.
Now, the EU is the furthest down this road, it appears. And how are they resolving some of these issues?
What I suspect will happen is that they're going to hit a specific number of countries with which they trade with. So countries like China, Russia, the big players, Brazil, India, things of that nature, countries of that nature. And they'll probably have to exclude a lot of the smaller countries because then administration would just be a nightmare if you included all, 100 and whatever countries that you happen to trade with. And then they'll probably have to do some sort of a simplified version of these import tariffs applied to basic good structures. So rather than saying, I'm going to estimate the specific emissions intensity of the producers of beef, for example, that I'm importing from, I'm just going to have to simplify this and do something simple. What they're talking about is doing a pilot project later in the summer. So we'll see. We're actually awaiting these these details later in the year, but I think it's going to be a real question as to how they implement this. And then, of course, there's the question of, well, how do you address this in the WTO? If somebody raises any kind of concerns around discrimination or what have you, there's concessions that you can make, there's concessions within the WTO rules that allow countries to kind of implement these kinds of policies, but they've never been tried. Like this is a completely theoretical construct that we haven't seen yet. So it remains to be seen how it's going to be adjudicated inside those frameworks.
Now, Francis, as you say, this is all theoretical. Everybody's talking at this point, but they've been talking for a while about this. So this isn't new. Didn't just pop up on the radar. Is there any chance that this will be one of those issues that kind of, it just implodes because of the inherent complexity of it?
You know what? It's a strong possibility, but like many people, I'm actually a lot more optimistic about seeing this come up simply because we happen to have maybe a little bit of a perfect storm of governments around the world that are setting more aggressive, both net zero targets and also more aggressive interim emissions reduction targets. We have a lot of like-minded leaders now, with at least among advanced economies, about addressing climate change. And I think there's a strong possibility that if the EU program, the pilot program, is able to get off the ground, able to pass legal muster within the WTO, then we will likely see a lot more countries at the table trying to talk about, perhaps, and this is my hope, of kind of a unified framework among advanced economies, all of which are like-minded about wanting to tax carbon and implement more stringent climate policies, trying to push the rest of the world to try to adopt those same policies. I mean, this is really is one of the main tools, or in fact, probably the only tool where we can, that has some teeth, where advanced economies can influence climate policy abroad that otherwise might not adopt these kinds of things.
Can you take a guess at a timeline here for when the EU might do its pilot project, and even when Canada and the US might come to an agreement?
I suspect, and that's a great question, I think that's kind of on everyone's mind. I suspect we're going to see the launch of the pilot program probably later in the summer. There's already a proposal that's working its way through EU legislation or the legislative bodies. So we'll likely see details later this summer. Ideally, I think a lot of countries are thinking that we might have this conversation at COP26 in Glasgow in November. That would be an amazing opportunity for everyone to come together and not just talk about, net zero, not just talk about new technologies, but actually talk about policy tools that will actually get us there, this being a core piece of that. But what I'm afraid will happen is that we won't have the evidence of how this policy will actually work from the EU before we get to that point. I mean, November is not that far away, and we're already starting to see a few cracks in the cooperation between these big governments, particularly from Japan and the US, and kind of aligning on climate policies. So ideally, we'd like to see something in November, but my worry is that we just won't have the evidence to make that happen.
Well, Francis, thank you very much for this. I always appreciate your insights. Good talking to you.
Great to be here, Markham.